WISC TV now presents For the Record.
A conversation with Todd Berry on the state of the state over the last 25 years is next on For the Record. Thanks for joining us. I'm Neil Heinen. It's a little bit of a coincidence, really. We asked Todd Berry to share some thoughts on the job from which he just retired, 25 years as president of the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance. For any one of those years, Todd might be exactly the person we would ask to come analyze the governor of Wisconsin's annual report on the health and welfare of the state, and we'll probably take advantage of his joining us just days after this year's address to offer some perspective. But what we really want to talk about is the big picture, what Todd Berry has learned and what he has tried to teach us about state and local government and policies and politics in Wisconsin for a quarter of a century. So I'm pleased to welcome back to For the Record, Todd Berry.
Thank you, Neil.
Nice to see you again.
It is good to be back.
This is an interesting juxtaposition here. I hadn't anticipated your retirement, and I know it could have.
Some people have been long hoping.
Yes,
for.
I know. Congratulations. I'm interested
thank you
in
very
seeing
much.
what comes next. But so much of your work, Todd, I mean, people are familiar with it on a variety of levels. But when I think of all the teaching that you've done, all of the citizen groups and student groups that you've spoken to, many of them that I have brought to you, it's just an opportunity, I think, for us to ask you over these last 25 years what you've learned. And particularly, I'm looking at the last issue of The Focus, which we'll talk about in a bit, that you wrote, that highlights some of the things that are indicative of the challenges that we face in Wisconsin. And maybe you could just start there.
Yeah. Well, you know, over the last 25 years, just as American politics has become this way, Wisconsin politics has become much more of a take no prisoners kind of sport. And I know over the years watching state budgets and so forth, I was often asked, why do we do these fairly stupid things? You know, our bond ratings haven't been as high as they could be, budgets are late, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, in thinking about it, it was mainly institutional things and the way our politics had changed that I could come up with to explain. And it's that way in spades in Washington. I mean, we've got a new shut down the government controversy every several weeks. So
I remember over the years having various budget directors come in and meet with the editorial board top. Democrat and Republican alike were just absolutely unequivocal in defending the appropriateness of running budget deficits, of what we refer to as kicking the can down the road, and even sort of resisted this idea that not following generally accepted accounting principles was an okay thing to do.
Yeah. Well, you know, the one way to sort of counteract that, and of course you've got to understand that budget directors, cabinet secretaries are political appointees, and they all sing out of the same hymn book. Now, incidentally, there's the same hymn book for the opposition and those in power. They simply changed the tune, as we saw in the governor's speech. Either things are absolutely wonderful, or, as the opposition says, they're absolutely terrible. But you look at local government, school districts, the university, they are all generally in good financial state. They keep funds for emergencies. I mean, that's what financial planners tell us to do at home, but they can't get it at the state level. And having been asked why for years and years, I could only come up with a political explanation.
And well, but it's a nuanced political explanation, right? I mean, I'm thinking about this quite a long-term problem now that we have with the inability to think long-term. Now, a lot of that is due to the election cycles, to the full-time legislature that you point to, but it shows up in this 2-year thinking.
Well, or 1 year or 6 month thinking. I mean, the fundamental change in psychology is when we decided to pay legislators as full-time employees and give them a really good state benefit package. What you do have, and I'm not saying everybody, but there are a good number of legislators, include a number in this area, who rely on the legislature for basically their sole means of living. And I think it changes the psychology of the place, because you're always, it's only rational to want to hold your job, whatever the job is. And I think that they have their eye on the next election and do not deliver bad news, don't do anything gutsy or long-term. And they will privately admit this to you, whatever they say publicly. So in thinking about this, and you mentioned the column I wrote, I started to think about institutional and structural things that we have done that cause this behavior. And no doubt part of it is just the national political environment and partisanship and discourse. But I do think that the way we have structured elections and politics in this state get that short-term thinking.
I'm sure I've talked to Kathy Kramer about this, Todd, but does the divisiveness in the legislature reflect the divisiveness in the state, or does the divisiveness in the state follow this political science, you know, that is so election-driven, politics-driven?
Well, there's no question that our politics generally has become more divisive, and that the partisans in some respects have caused it. But I'll tell you, as you know, have given 80, 100, 120 speeches a year around the state at local governments, civic community groups. And it is just a joy to go out there. People are so nice and respectful and polite. And in local government, I mean, there are places that are a little dysfunctional, but they do get things done, and they do plan ahead. So I think it's a little unfair to condemn the people of the state or the culture of the state, because we are really Midwest nice people.
We're not going to end the show without talking about what we can do to fix it. But in the context, you know, of what's wrong here, when we come back, let's take a little bit at where we are currently and how some of these issues are manifesting themselves. And we will do that with the retiring Todd Berry right after this. After 25 years, Todd Berry has retired as president of the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance, and he joins us to talk about those 25 years. And just so we don't forget, the Taxpayers Alliance has just morphed slightly with your departure.
They are combining with a Milwaukee group. There'll be a larger staff. There'll be 2 offices. The mission doesn't really change, and particularly from the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance side, it has been a dedication to, you know, statewide teaching and informing people about state and local government, and that really is more important now than ever. So there's a lot of work to do.
Provided an analysis of budgets, of government decisions, of sort of the policies we were talking about here, that I think a lot of business leaders, a lot of government leaders really relied on in a lot of ways.
And I hope that kind of work continues, and it continues to play that role.
So, to the extent that we can in such a short period of time, what is the state of the state, Todd, relative to other states, relative to what a state like Wisconsin, the opportunities that it has in a 21st century global economy?
Well, the economy actually, as it is nationally, is reasonably good. You know, all the statistics, low unemployment and so forth, the things you would expect from now the second longest expansion in post-war history. It hasn't been, and it isn't even now, a particularly robust, explosive kind of economy, but it chugs along. But as we were talking, we do tend to still do things on a short-term financial basis. I mean, the state does have surpluses now, in part because the economy is better, in part, frankly, because they do play some tricks with borrowing and the way they account for things. So,
as they always have.
And we continue, although, you know, it's a little better. If you were to compare our reserves to other states. Relative to the size of our budgets, we still are below average and always have been.
Yeah. One of the things you've talked about for as long as I've known you, Todd, is the demographic challenges that Wisconsin face, and it seems like that still drives a fair number of the issues that we have to deal with.
It's absolutely huge, and what's so frustrating, this is such a great example of short-term thinking. The fact that the baby boomers were going to retire is not something that's a mystery, you know, and the fact that school enrollments have been dropping in Wisconsin since 2003 is hardly a mystery. And now in 2014, 15, 16, we talk about labor shortage and need for workers as if this is some big surprise. And the thing, we could have been preparing for this a long time ago. And both Democrats and Republicans, current governor, past governors, all could have played more of a leadership role.
I mean, in part, this is a political conversation, but it's also, I think, more of a philosophical conversation among, economists, regional thinkers about strategies that states employ to deal with those demographic realities, with job growth. And is Wisconsin doing enough to retain talent, attract talent, grow the kinds of businesses that we think we know are going to be the businesses of the 21st century?
Well, you know, we are making efforts. There's one thing that I think we need to remember, and we haven't paid attention to the way we could, and that is when you look at the national research, most of the jobs are created by startups and young firms on trajectories. You can certainly see that in the Dane County area. And we do not rank high, as you know, certainly in the bottom half or even worse in terms of states that are spawning new firms. So that's something, part of it I think is our conservative, Germanic, Northern European tradition. We are conservative in terms of taking risk. Now, having said that, people that do create businesses in Wisconsin tend to do a better job of keeping them going. So when we do it well, but we just need to do more of it. And we need to work on that in our schools, in our university, in our culture, to be more proactive and entrepreneurial.
So what is your perspective on the health of the university and the K-12 system, both in terms of finance, support, governance, relation to the state and the people?
Yeah, I'm tempted to say, invite me back. It's such a long conversation.
Yeah, I agree.
School finance, K-12, is not as bad as some people paint, but schools have been under revenue limits now for 20 plus years. So, they've had to, really manage. University, I think, is a little clearer in that when you look at the appropriation figures, really the university is not getting any more money than it did in about 2000, 2001. I mean, we can quibble over 50 million or whatever. But under neither the former governor or this governor, one Democrat, one Republican, it's pretty much been on, freeze kind of mode. And people don't want to hear this, but, UW-Madison is not a tax-supported university. It's tax-assisted, but you have maybe only 15% of your revenues coming from state taxes, and yet we still run it as if it's the 1950s and the governor and the legislature should be micromanaging the place. We need to have a big discussion in the state about how we fund and how we govern higher education, but that's a whole other discussion.
Right, but in the meantime, are you concerned about the university's ability to maintain its lofty regard and ranking in terms of world universities?
Yeah. Well,
is that important?
Well, no, it is important. When you ask people what makes Wisconsin special, about what's the one thing we can be proud of that we've created, I mean, obviously we've been given things like water and so forth, but probably our one legacy is the university, and particularly the Madison campus. And not that they don't sometimes shoot themselves in the foot, they do, but it's very hard to rebuild something that's been chipped away at in that kind of environment, particularly because now the private universities, the Chicagos, the Northwesterns, the Harvards, the Stanfords, have resources that we can't access. Now, we're lucky in Madison that we do have an endowment, we do have WARF, so Madison's perhaps doing better than some of the outstate campuses.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Berry, when we come back, your prescription.
Okay.
With Todd Berry right after this. My guest is Todd Berry, who has been president of the Wisconsin Taxpayers Alliance for 25 years, and we are mining those 25 years for wisdom as we look at the state of our state today. But let's return to some of the political stuff, Todd, as we think about what we can do in this state and the reality of returning to a part-time legislature, of redistricting reform, of election reform. Help us understand why some of those things might be beneficial and whether there's a chance of ever doing
I tend to believe that the way you design organizations and governments and so forth, that structure matters, that people react to the rules and structure you give them. And when we decided, both nationally and in Wisconsin, to have a full-time career legislature, I think over time it changed our politics. And the thinking, as we talked about earlier, has become very short-term. The other thing it's done is because you rely on the legislature for your job, it gives great power to the core party leadership. And I'm not disparaging any people.
Right,
I'm just talking about the institution.
It's the reality of it.
And so to get bills passed, to get on committees, to chair committees, to get appointed to the Joint Finance Committee, all the things that you want as a legislator, you rely on the leadership for, and they can punish by stripping you of some of those goodies. They can direct outside political contributions for or against, and they can even find you a primary. So it's become a much more partisan enterprise and a much more top-down kind of enterprise because of that. And all that means it's become much more partisan. And again, as we said, part of it's national and part of it's state culture, but I think that we've created it, and I don't think people understand how unusual we are, because there's only about 10 or 12 legislatures in the country that are called full-time career professional, and they're all big states, either populous or geographic. California, New York, Illinois, Massachusetts, etc. And I'll tell you, when you look at those states, the one thing Wisconsin has in common with them is they tend to have late state budgets. They tend to be fiscally more in peril. Their financial statements don't look as good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. And I think the proof is in the pudding.
One of your recommendations put me in mind of an experience I had in New Hampshire 20 years ago in visiting the assembly in New Hampshire. Todd, a state that size has an assembly of, I think, 400 members. And you run into them at the deli as they're all there for lunch, and the collegiality and, of course, their knowledge of their voters. It's such a stark contrast to what we have here.
And you know, when I was a young political science grad, the thought of the New Hampshire legislature horrified me. But you know, one of the ideas I put out was, what if we had a state assembly, and then, because I'm talking about structural change here, that had 300 members. Now, most people would recoil in horror at that, but think about it. I mean, you can then become a part-time legislator. They don't get paid as much. They don't need as much staff. Districts, population-wise, become much smaller. So it's easier for a citizen to campaign. It costs less to campaign. And here's the thing, people complain about campaign spending. And you can tinker with that, but I think if you had much smaller legislative districts, how can outside interests influence a district where it isn't efficient to buy mass media. It changes the whole dynamic. And it also has the advantage of all this attack advertising I don't think works as well, because suddenly constituents are more likely to know you and you them, and they're not going to put up with all this mud that gets thrown that is frankly untrue.
Right.
So
the United States Supreme Court might decide this for us, but is redistricting reform, should that happen, could that be the entry point to some of this stuff, or is...
You know, I think it should happen, whether it's the Iowa approach or there's some new, more sophisticated academic approaches out there. But I think people delude themselves if they think it's the panacea, because Madison is never going to elect a Republican, and Ozaukee County is not going to elect a Democrat because of the way people choose to live. I think it's a first step, but I think more important is that when you have gerrymandered districts that tend to favor one party or another, and then you have partisan primaries, you have low turnout, low interest, August, primaries, and so who votes? The hardcore. So on the Democratic side, it tends to be the left activists. On the Republican side, it tends to be the right activists. So in the 2016 election, half of the seats in the legislature were decided by September. So there's no choice, there's no accountability to voters. So I think we've got to get rid of party primaries. The Great La Follette legacy turns out to be, I think, pretty much a disaster because it creates two extreme camps in the legislature. How are they going to compromise when they don't need to?
I've enjoyed these conversations over 25 years, Todd. Let's not let them end, all right?
Oh,
all right.
no,
You're welcome back anytime.
Lots more to talk about.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
We're going to come back and wrap up For the Record right after this. My thanks to Todd Berry and to you for spending part of your day with us. We'll see you next week on For the Record.